Still working on ideology, Terry Eagleton's book, now in chapter 5, and we're from Adorno to Bourdieu. There's a number of thinkers in here. I'm going to concentrate on Adorno and chunk of Althusser, and then a little bit on Bourdieu. Not too much on Bourdieu, mostly on Adorno and Althusser. Now, before I do anything, just want to mention just a few things before I get to Adorno. Critical theory, usually when it's like written like this, with capitals, it means a very particular school. Not always, but roughly if you see critical theory written like that, it's a species, right? So this critical theory with the capitals is like a particular version of critical theory, and critical theory with the capitals is the way I'm going to be using it in my lecture. So it's always this thing here. Even though keep in mind that critical theory with no capitals can include all kinds of things like feminist theory, queer theory, decolonialization theory. There's lots and lots of them. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about that critical theory which is associated with the Frankfurt School. Starts up in Frankfurt in the 20s, and it's shut down around 1933 by the Nazis. The figures that come out of the Frankfurt School, like the first generation especially, there's roughly 2 generations, as far as I know. Maybe they subdivided them into more, but I think there's roughly 2 of these generations. The first ones are like Adorno, right? That's our guy. Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer. Adorno and Horkheimer wrote a very famous Dialectic of Enlightenment. Very famous book, comes out in 40s roughly, and you can see that their views have been shaped by the traumatic experience of encountering Nazism and what their views on ideology were as a result of being exposed to this. Okay, and then Herbert Marcuse's probably most famous work, like One Dimensional Man, maybe you've come across that, and then another important figure is Walter Benjamin. So I'm just going to basically be looking at Adorno. In this lecture, we're in these lectures that I'm doing on ideology. Look also for a video that is mine on the 1937 essay called Traditional and Critical Theory. Again, this critical theory. And this is by Horkheimer. So that's Horkheimer's essay, which sort of could be read, some people say, and there's never a full agreement on this, but you could be safely, you could safely say that this essay kind of gives the Frankfurt School sort of their manifesto, something like that. So I've got a video on that. You can check that essay out. Very famous essay, and he kind of lays it out. What is critical thinking? Or critical theory, sorry, not critical thinking, critical theory, as opposed to what is traditional theory. So it's a nice contrast between what he's up to and his buddies here in the Frankfurt School, and sort of the older school of philosophers who are more in the traditional line. Okay, and then later on in the second generation, I think pretty well the most famous thinker of it is the philosopher Jürgen Habermas. Right, and very immensely well-known figure, and immensely influential. Okay, so let's think a little bit more about this. So these guys are basically, they're all coming out of various versions of Marxism. Not so much the economic stuff, but more like kind of like the cultural Marxism, sort of a Western European notion of cultural Marxism. And it's several generations. And basically, they were interdisciplinary type thinkers, blending sociology, philosophy, a lot of things with an eye to emancipation. So it wasn't just an abstract study like philosophy. No, these guys were, like, they had an activist edge. They were going somewhere with the work. Kind of like as Marx said, vis-a-vis philosophers, like, the philosophers are too abstract. Hegel, for instance, said that philosophy, and a great image from the Philosophy of Right in the opening passages of it. He says, philosophy always comes on the scene too late, right? It only comes on the scene after things are done, and then tries to understand them. And then he has this very, I think, a very beautiful and arresting, striking image where he says the owl of Minerva, like philosophy, only spreads her wings with the coming of the dusk. Right? So it's at nighttime. That's when philosophy looks at what happened during the day, kind of like the nightly news, right? Whereas Marx says something like, well, yeah, but the goal is not just to understand the world, like, you know, in an ivy tower, just looking down at nighttime going, oh, what happened during the day? That's not the thing. The thing is to change it, right? To look at society and to change it. And if you recall in a previous video, I talked about you know, the world and ideas are bound up for these kinds of thinkers, right? There isn't this contemplative consciousness sitting back and looking at the world. No, that's the wrong way to think about things. They're just not like that. Okay, so we've got sort of this activism philosophy all bound up, emancipation, right? We're going to change things through our studies. We're not just studying things for the sake of studying things. Okay. So then, and then of course, from the Germans, we'll shift a little bit over to Althusser and Bourdieu, look at the French. So again, we're still Western European territory. Now let's think. We saw a couple of videos, and I think in chapter 3 of Eagleton's book, you know, we looked at how Marx, at the opening of Capital, you know, he starts with the commodity. How does sort of how do things appear to us, right? Through the commodity, right? The thing, right? That's how sort of the world appears to us. And he starts off with things. And, you know, like Hegel, who starts off the philosophy of right with property. So with stuff, right? Owning stuff. And it's an atomized picture of the world because there's individual things. That's how reality first comes to us. Economically, it comes to us through commodities, products, stuff you buy, right? You wherever, and that would be whether you're looking at stuff online or you're looking at through shop windows or whatever. It's stuff, right? It's all about things. And as we also saw earlier, that if you have these things in front of you, there's various ways that these things come to dominate, right? And we saw a discussion of Marx, like in earlier on when Eagleton was looking at the two sides of Marx, right? In German ideology and in Das Kapital. You know, there's a way that these things come to be controlling, right? And it's sometimes it's to do with consciousness, sometimes it's just to do with the actual facts of the world, but they become fetishized and they become some sort of controlling regime in some way. They become independent and controlling. And they are controlling. It's not just, you know, in part of Marx, where later Marx, they're not just seen to be controlling, they really are controlling. And so, you know, we sometimes do think of, sometimes we're letting things control your life. Like, do you own your stuff? Right? The old thing would be sometimes say if someone's too materialistic, do you own your stuff or does your stuff own you? Well, some people are owned by their stuff, right? You know, that's all they worry about is their stuff. Okay. So, this, if you think of this stuff owning individuals, that the stuff of the system owns everything. So commodities dominate. Okay, that's one way. That's one kind of important category, is the category of the commodity, right? So again, when you're reading philosophers and thinkers, always try and zero in on how they cut the world up. As Plato liked to say, look for the way philosophers cut the world. Are they getting it at its joints, right? Really at its joints? Are they cutting it up in a variety of ways? So that's always very important to think about when you're reading philosophy. What are the fundamental concepts that the author, just as Marx says, he just says, we see it through commodity. I'm not going to really justify that. I'm just going to explain what a commodity is, right? You could challenge it. But okay, another category that's very important is this notion of exchange value. Now, Marx's discussions of this, very fascinating, very complex, giving kind of a simplified introduction. But if you want to dig into this, go to Das Kapital and read the opening passages. You'll get a rich sort of discussion of notions of value and commodities and whatnot. Okay, but for our purposes here, it's something a little more simple, and it goes like this. The key concept, the other concept than the commodity, is this notion of exchange value. Fairly abstract thing. We encounter it a lot. One of the ways that we often encounter it is if roughly again, that there's different kinds of value, right? Even in the way we see things. One fundamental distinction is between exchange value and use value. Now, a real hand waving way of exchanging or comparing those two concepts of value can go something like this. If you ever find yourself, you go on these platforms where people sell their stuff, like used cars or whatever, okay? And then, of course, there's an inevitable sort of bargaining and a little bit of negotiating. Two things kind of happen when you're involved in these discussions. If you have let's say you're the seller, and you're selling something you've had for a long time. Let's say you have an old vehicle, right? And it runs really well, and it's been very important to you. You've used it a lot. You've gotten a lot of use out of it, and you've never had to put much money into it or whatever. So, and and you don't want to sell it or whatever. But let's say for reasons you just have to sell it. Maybe you need the money or whatever. So, but you're like, this is a great car. It's really useful. So that car to you, with its physical properties, right? Its tires and its engine and all that, it has a high use value for you, right? It's like, this is an extremely useful car. And I say, yeah, but it's old. Yeah, but it's really useful. It's in great shape and all that. And I want 10 grand for it. Okay, so you're selling you want 10 grand for your car. And I walk up to you and I go, are you kidding? That thing is this old, blah, blah, blah. And then I pull out, some websites and I look at similar cars and I say, you know what, you're asking 10 grand for that. And I look at on the market, you know what, there's no way I'm going to give you more than 4. You're lucky if I give you 5, really lucky. Maybe if there's something extremely special about it, but really, that's all it's worth. So that's an exchange value, right? That's what the market, as we often say, well, in the eyes of the market, your car is worth 4 grand. I don't care about your eyes. You think it's worth a lot more because it's extraordinarily useful to you. It'll be useful to me too. I'm not denying that. That's why I'm interested in buying it. But the market only so much. Or on the other hand, it's like, let's say you're in the market for a vintage car or whatever, and you think, well, I'm going to buy an old Volkswagen Beetle or something, or an old Volkswagen Bus, and they can't be that expensive. They're all really old and rickety. And then you think, I'll buy one for a couple of grand, and then you go to places and people are like, oh, I want 40 grand for 50 grand. And you think there's no way that thing is, you can't get that much use. I'm just going to drive it around for fun in summer. It's not that useful. For a little toy, that's the other end of it that people are willing to pay. So what's the market value? The exchange value will often be, a very kind of abstract thing, and we do say, well, that's what people will pay. Okay, that's not quite what Marx is talking about, but that's just sort of a bit of a primer, an intuition primer to make the difference between, like use value and exchange value, market value. There's different ways of valuation, and they also will eventually lead down to money. Right? So we can have disagreements when we have different ways of valuing things, right? So the commodities are, shall we say, are rather slippery beasts. They can control us. They have different value ascriptions. A little closer, but still a simplification of Marx, goes something like this. When you have a physical thing, okay, so you got your physical thing, it's got its properties, and they can be put to use. So they have a use value, like, I don't know, like a physical thing made of iron. It's hard. You can use it to build with or hit things or support things. It's got uses that are there that are part of like its physical properties of rigidity or stiffness. You could have, now I'm going to take a very concrete example, just borrowing it from Eagleton here. Let's say you have Christmas pudding and you have a Christmas toy. Two very different commodities, right? They're both marketplace commodities, very different. One you buy to eat, one you buy to play with. And so eating and playing. So those are very, very different. Arguably, how do you compare those things, right? Well, they are use values wise, they're incredibly different. So if you're having the family over and dinner's done, you want to wheel out the giant pudding, right? That's what you really want at that time. That's very useful. But if it's Christmas morning or whatever, you got a bunch of kids that are all yelling, yay, Santa was here. They see the cookies and the milk is is gone. They're not going to be happy if you go Christmas pudding time. No, they want this stuff. So these are very different items of use values, quite different. But if they have behind them sort of the history of these objects coming into existence, because they are made objects, right? You know, they don't grow on trees. Christmas toys, Christmas pudding, they're manufactured items, right? So in that sense, they have labor. So Marx has a very particular view of what labor is and whatnot. I'm not going to get into all that. But if they have the same labor to make that's behind them, they would probably have the same exchange value. So again, very different use value, same exchange value. Okay, so that's why through this notion, this more abstract notion of value and sort of like the history of labor behind it, you can make these sort of an abstract equivalence, right? Abstract equivalence can be done through exchange value by talking about the background labor. So incommensurates, like eating and playing, things for eating, eat things for playing, this abstract notion of value creates this exchange value. You get an abstract equivalent, which makes incommensurate, eating, playing, things, pudding, toy, commensurate, that you can relate them to each other, right? So that's how the market will help us make things that look wildly different. In the eyes of the market, they're both $40, right? And this notion of using special techniques and systems to make incommensurate things the same is a high level. You're abstracting from all kinds of things. It's done everywhere. Think about that lovely example of a mathematician who specializes in topology, which is a branch of mathematics. A coffee cup is equivalent topologically to a donut, right? Why? That sounds crazy because they're both very different. Although I like my coffee and a donut in the morning, my coffee and donut are very different things. Well, in the eyes of a topological structure, they're the same. They're basically a ring with a hole in it. And if it's just a simple ring with a hole in it, I eat it. It's the donut. But if I could deform that ring a little bit, keep the hole and deform the ring, and not rip it or tear it, but kind of make a dent in it, I could pour a little coffee in that dent, and I have a coffee, right? So this idea of making, there are ways that we can make incommensurate things commensurables and by abstracting from things, right? Because remember, to abstract from something is to pick some properties of it and let the others go. You abstract from. You're releasing certain things. You're saying that's not important. So the taste and the playability is not important. We're abstracting from all that. We're just looking at the history of the object and its background labor, and that's how we get an abstract equivalence. Same thing in mathematics. It's a little more subtle, but the idea is still the same. We're abstracting from the object's color, its shape, and all these kinds of things, and looking at it as a volume. Each, a coffee cup and a donut, is basically a volume with a hole in it, right? Dents don't really matter. You abstract from all that. Okay, so this abstract exchange can appear in a variety of ways. I talked about it with objects like toys and pudding, coffee cups and donuts. It also, this principle of abstraction to create equivalencies, to make incommensurate things commensurate, can also pop up in a variety of ways. So something could be true at one level because you've abstracted from all these things, and we got to be careful that we don't reify our abstractions and think that a partial is the whole story. Remember, that was one view of being ideological, is taking apart for the whole. The synecdoche thing, see previous video for more discussion of that. Think about it. Some people say, oh, well, democracy is a great leveling thing, because if you have somebody who's fantastically wealthy and somebody who's extremely poor, the billionaire pauper kind of sort of line, using some pretty old-fashioned language, they both walk in the voting booth and they're the same. Why? Because they each get one vote. They're basically abstractions. When you walk in, you lose your identity except as a pure citizen, kind of like a person that doesn't have really any conditions except eligibility to cast a ballot. and you go in there and you're the same. So paupers and billionaires, cabbages and kings, judges and everybody, we're all equal in the eyes of the voting system, as in the democracy. Same thing. So again, in the eyes of the law, we're all equal, aren't we? There's no law that says in, like a liberal democracy like Canada that says, oh, people in this group, well, there is a little bit of that, but basically we're all equal in the eyes of the law, right? There have been some judgments made for certain communities that get special kinds of things allotted when they're making judgments. But by and large, no individual person is regarded as, oh, they're above the law or they're outside or they're in a totally special category. No, there might be mitigating and aggravating factors, but in general, it is eyes of the law, same, voting booths, same. These are what, like Marx, these are abstract equivalences. Okay, so now let's think, because when we move into talking about Adorno, which is the first guy we're going to talk about, is this notion of abstract exchange will be at the heart of his discussion of ideology. So run out of board space. See you next video.